Hello everyone, you're welcome to this week's Tech Tuesdays webinar on use case dynamically call list of APIs and create CSV file with output. I'm Brinda, your host for today's webinar. We have with us Ishwar Anand from the Global Customer Support team, having rich experience in cloud application integration. Before we start this webinar, here are some housekeeping tips. This webinar is for 1 hour, including the 15 minutes Q&A. You can post your queries in the Q&A box. Dial-in participants are muted for this webinar. The session is being recorded and will be available in the Informatica Support YouTube channel and the Success portal. The recording will be emailed to you as well. You can put in your feedbacks and suggestions for our session in the post-webinar survey. The Tech Tuesdays webinar program is hosted within the Success portal. The Informatica Success portal is a microlearning platform offering free and unlimited learning to all registered users. This feature-rich platform was launched to help you learn and use Informatica products better. Here are a few important links that you can go over later that will help you in your product adoption journey with Informatica. Over to you, Ishwar. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Let's start with today's topic, which is CAI use case, calling list of APIs dynamically and creating CSV file from their response. My name is Ishwar and I'll be presenting this slide. Thank you. So agenda for today, understanding how we call a web service from Service Connector, reading and using delimited file, which contain list of APIs, generating CSV file from the XML data received from API, calling list of APIs in parallel using milestone step in sub-process call. And at the end, we'll use dispatch service for controlling the process execution so that we control how much process will execute. So let's start. So the first we'll see how we call a web service using Service Connector. For that, what we'll do is we will use a CEI web service, which will output a book.xml file. This will be a sample file and we will create the sample web service in this demo so that we will use those files. So we'll use these web services and call it multiple times based on the file list, which will have all the details. The file list will contain number of web service and a template file which will have field details. We will configure Service Connector to get response. So let me show you a few things which we have discussed, right? So this is the books.xml or the sample XML file which we will be using. It contains book information, so you can see that there are like 12 books. So for now, we will use the same XML for different APIs. Okay, and this is the API list. So we will create these two APIs where we will use these kind of things. And so the use case will be like, let's say you have this API 1 and API 2. API 1 requires a payload like this, and API 2 requires a payload like this. And you have a few template file which defines because what file, what fields you need. Because if you see here in the book.xml, we have ID, author, title, and price, published date, description, and all. But um, in my use case, we have a requirement that we need only certain fields from this XML, and we want to create a file based on those. So let's say for our sample API 1, we have 4 fields required: ID, author, title, and price. So upon receiving this XML from a web service, we will extract only these 4 fields and try to create a CSV file from these. Okay, so now we will create sample process which will file. So for now, I'm making it anonymous because So, making this as whole payload because we don't need this response feed. We just need the XML which will be presenting. We'll select the data type as any. In the real scenario, this you will be having this from some vendor where you will have a list of APIs which will be giving you some XML. Yeah, so this is our one API. Similarly, we will create the other one. Now what we'll do, we will call these API through a service connector. So for that, we will create a service connector first. So here in this use case, we want that there should be some web services which are very similar in nature, like the payload or the at least the URLs are similar, so that we will try to make a generic connector instead of creating connector for each of the API. We'll name it generic service connector. And API name will be the part which is varying. So see if you see in two of our sample service, only this API name is changing. So that's why I want that as an input to our service connector. So for now, I'm just giving one as a sample, but when we will pass it from process, then this will be dynamic. This is, I'm creating a test service connector. And for now, the payload I'm using as a query parameter, but same kind of concept can be used if you have a payload, XML payload or some complex payload. We'll make this as required because we want these inputs to be passed and we don't want them to be passed as a parameter because we will configure the binding by ourselves manually rather than using the parameter. So I'll show you next. Let's say we have this URL. Now what we want is that this API name part should be passed from process. So mention API name. And then the query parameter also we want to pass from the input. So we'll pass also here. All right, and we want content as XML. So we are setting the accept header. And this is a simple get call because we don't need um, something very specific and we don't want to post a lot of things. Okay, so we got 200 response and we got the sample data. Now what we need to do is we need to extract this book information out of this payload and send it back, because this is a response, and if you see the output is still blank because we have not defined output fields. That's the next step. We'll define response and then we'll choose any type. Here we'll write expression. I've already created a sample one. I'll just copy it from there. Let's test and see what result is coming. Okay. So if you see, we got books repeating. So like if you see the book tag is ending, the new book tag is starting. So now this, we will pass it to our process and the process will do the rest. And one important note here is that in this action, if you have some special characters, like some multi-byte characters, then the response encoding, you should set it to UTF-8. And now I will publish the service connector. I will also make a connection on top of the service connector so that I can use the service connector inside process. Now we will select the service connector which we have created as type. And we want to run it on our secure agent. You can also run it on cloud. So this secure agent is running locally on my machine, which I'm going to use. I'm using it locally because I also want to read file from this same machine, which has the API list and information like templates. Okay, so I will publish this connection. Okay, so now we have a service connector and a connection ready, which we can use in our process to call a web service and get response. Let's call this from our process and see if it works. So this is the process which we will be modifying throughout our presentation to make the correct process which will suffice our use case. We'll name this as read write process. Now we'll select the same connection which we have created. This is our service connector action. In the input field, we will pass the API name, which could be either API1, sample API1 or sample API2, right? Because these are the two which we have created with the process. And in the payload, we'll pass this generic payload because we are not using this anywhere, but it is mandatory to make a call to the web service because it's a mandatory field. And we will create an output field to see the response. We use this assignment step to assign the output of web service. Since we are using a generic type, we will have to use formula because the type is not exactly same. Response. This response field is coming from the service connector output FCC, which we have assigned here. Right. Okay. Now, going forward, I will modify this process, and instead of making one call where we are hard coding the API name and payload, what we will try to do is we will read the file, this file, and we will read its row, and based on the row, we will call this web service. And now we will read the file list, right, and also the template file, and we'll try to parameterize our service call. So we'll declare some fields like which we want to extract. Here we will use unpar text function. This function basically reads the file from secure agent using xquery. So to execute this, your process must run on secure agent, which we will also do. Currently, our process is running on cloud because it reads from the local agent. If you execute it on cloud, you will get an error that you cannot access that file because using these function on our cloud environment is not allowed. Now, this unpar text will give the text what we have in this file. But what we need is we need a list type of data, which is a XML list, so that we can iterate on that list, right? So this is how we'll convert it. Like we'll run a for on these. And we want that with all the new lines should come here, right? In the I. Now we should return. Oh. Now this should return us the row of list, basically from the file, API list file, which we're trying to read. Okay, now we have changed the environment to agent. So let's see if this runs fine now. Okay, so since we have changed the environment, the URL must have also changed. So if you see, this is the localhost URL now, it's no longer published on cloud. So we'll have to use that new URL. Okay, URL ran fine. Now let's see what data did we got. So for that, we will check advanced view of the process, where we will see what was the data that we got in our temp field, which is this rise API list. So we are going to check what data was populated in the API list field. So in this advanced view, if you check the variable part, which will be here, right? You so you can check what was the exact value which was populated in the variable. So like in our case, we want to check a temp variable. That's why we are going to temp variable. See, we have a field name as API list, and we have 3 rows in it. Now what we want is, since we have 2 fields which we need to pass it to our generic service connector, and the same we need to extract it from the list of um, file list which we have extracted. So one is API name and other one is payload. So we will define these 2 fields which we want to extract. Now first what we'll do is, since we already got the list, now we will iterate on the list so that we will use one item of the list at a time. So for that, what we'll use, first we'll use a decision step to check whether our list is empty or not. So if you see, when we have selected this, it has created 2 paths for us. One is it's not empty and it is empty. So when the list is empty, we would want to end our process. So I will just put an end here. And when the list is not empty, we are going to call this generic service, right? So but again, this is not going to be like this. We will add few other steps because we need to call this generic service connector based on this value or the API list which we have extracted. So now I will add assignment, so that first we need to take the first value of the list. For that, I will create one more field which will be, instead of API list, it will be API detail. In the API detail, what we will do, we will store head of our list. So that will be the first element of the list, right? So list. All right. Now what we need to do is we need to extract the fields from this API detail. So let's say we add another assignment, and we would want to configure API name as well as payload. So this we will extract based on the position. So here the position of the field should not change. So like API name is the first field and the payload is second. So we will use this information to get now, because now we have in this, after using head, we have this one value in our field. So now let's say if we want this, what we will do, we will tokenize this value, this complete value, based on the pipe, and then when we are going to choose the first position or the second positions. We have API detail, and we want to call tokenize function. Now, ideally, it will return a list of values, but we don't need. What we need is we need the first one because we are assigning it in the API name, and API name is the first field. So we will just give the index 1 here. Okay. Similarly, the payload should be the second index. We'll also need one more value, that is this template field, which has our field information. Here, what we need is we need the third field. Third field here. Now, if you see, when we check the process log here, we also have this extra character at the end. So for simplicity, we can just remove those. So these are also called /r characters. So let's say if you want to replace them, what you do is, okay, so now we have these three fields. Now what next we'll do, we will call our service based on these fields. So next we will, in the input, right, instead of hard coding these, we will pass the field value. So in the API name, we will pass API name, and in the payload, we will pass the payload field which we have defined. Now this should give us the response based on these two values. Now after that, what we'll do, since we have already extracted the response, we will be updating our list, because otherwise this head will always give us the first element if list is not updated. So to do this, we will use tail function, and here basically we will assign tail of the list to the list. So basically tails returns rest of the list except first element. And then we will jump back to the decision step where we check whether list is empty or not. All right, okay. So what we have made as of now is that you read a list of list file, and then you call each of the service one by one, right? And since till now we have not added that CSV part, we'll be extracting those template field details and putting it into the CSV. That is the next step that we will do. And now we'll basically get only the required fields as I've told in the beginning, and then we'll try to use file connection to create a CSV file based on these. And for doing that, we will use delimited content writer. So one small change I made is that so when we'll read the file and iterate through it, the first row will be this header row, right? So to skip that, what we did, we created a row count counter, okay, and we have initialized that with 0. And here we have checked that, okay, if it is 0 or not. 0 indicates that this is the first time when we are running this, and for 0 we are just skipping the whole thing and moving it to the API list assignment, where we are assigning tail and increasing the count. Total, it ran 3 times. If you see, row count is 3, and this is the data for the last one. So the second API. So API name is sample API 2, and payload is this, and the template file field is this. All right. So the next what we have is we will basically configure the CSV part. Yes, we can. So first thing is to extract the fields out of the response, because right now we are getting all the fields in response. To do that, first we will read the template field. And how we'll read that? Based on the template field name, because we will have a similar file created in the same directory, our directory. The response which we are assigning directly, we want that only template field should be assigned in it. The this particular file will have fields with a pipe delimited, right? So if you see this file, it will have IDs based on the pipe value. So that's why we will tokenize it with pipe. So now we will iterate for each row, right? So let's say for one of our call, we got 10 books data. So we want to iterate for 10 books and capture those fields which are defined in the template field. So first, what we'll do, we will our this is the response that is coming from service connector. Inside this, we want that only a certain field should come. For that, what we'll do is we will again create a loop, and this will iterate on the labels what we have created here. So these are the fields which we need. So now here, what we will use is we will use a function. Um, we call it as element. If we execute element like this, and execute, it gives us XML like this. So we will use this concept to generate our XML data based on the template field. So first section will describe the tag, and second will describe the value. So tag will be our $i, which is the label. right? And then the value, it will be, we will have to extract this value from record. So we use this node name function to basically make a X query based on the text value of this I, this part. Okay, and we use this qname function to get the qualified name of the text field, because this, the value which we have here, we are getting it from a file into this label, and then we are using that. Usually you will have to place the name here, like let's say if you want to get author, then you will have to give like record slash author slash text to get the author, but we have made this a dynamic one so that we can get the correct information. So this should basically give us the correct fields which are based on the template file which we are getting here. Okay, so the same we will use to create a CSV file. So let's first see if this works. Now what we want to verify here is that whether now in our response, the final response what we had here, the field out response, whether it contains only those specific field or it contains all the fields. Meanwhile, let's create a file connection. It would be file, and again we will have to publish this on the same secure agent where we are running our process and from where we are reading the file. For reading the file, we don't use this connection because the reader is an event-based reader. So if you want to read based on event, then we should use the event source. Otherwise, to read, we will have to use the unpar text function that we saw. See what we have here. Meanwhile, the connection is published. So this is our response field. And apart from response, we have out response, where if you see, we have only 4 fields: ID, author, title, and price. And if you see in the original one, we have author, price, and then genre, and then description, ID, title, published date. So what we did, we eliminated the fields which we didn't need it. And how we did? We did it based on these template files which are present in the API list name next to the API. Right. So now we will create a file based on this record. Okay. So we have already created a file connection. Now we will use that to create a file. If you define the connection, it will be like this, and you need to define the event target, and we will use a delimited content writer type event target. And directly what we will give is we want to create our files inside this target folder. So we'll copy this directory and place it here. And we will always create a new file. So for now we have chosen override, and we'll set eager delete to no. And the delimiter we want as pipe. Text qualifier is fine as double quotes. So we want a delimited content serialization task. Okay. For simplicity, we'll just add a new assignment using. So a few things what we need to add is first is file name. Right. So we want file name to be like API name with a timestamp. So we will use, for now we'll use just, I mean, you can add a timestamp also. For now, we'll just use the file name, and we will append it with the .txt format or .csv format. And then what we need is we need our custom objects to be added. We have custom objects. And here we will select the out response field, which will eventually create the files for us. So connection, and you say file connection, delimited content writer. So we have assigned the values to the delimited content writer, but we have not assigned that object file writer to the service call. You can see we already have two files now. Let's see if the data comes correctly. All right. So if you see now, what we have here is we have ID, author, title, and price, and we have the data from our API, and we have only 4 columns which we wanted to extract, not all data that is coming from API. And if you see for 2 calls, what we had in the API list, we have 2 respective files created. So if you can see this, and for the API too, although the data is same, but these are based on 2 different calls. And if you have hundreds of APIs in the list, then you can execute the same logic for hundreds of APIs, and you should be good to go. So next, what we have is breaking this process into a sub-process call and running this in parallel. Because right now what we did, we had this API list and we had 2 APIs, right? So considering that we may have a huge number of APIs as well, that let's say you have hundreds of APIs and you have a target within which you want to finish, and this approach is not fast enough for you because it will call the first API and then it will create a file for that and then it will call the second API, right? So to speed up that process, right, what we can do is we can break our process into sub process and we put a milestone step to execute these process in near parallel way. So we'll see how we can do that first. So first we'll create a sub process. So basically this list iteration we will break. So whatever we have here, we will put that into one sub process. So let's say this wrapper process, what it will be responsible for. Basically, it will trigger the process. So this will be our wrapper process, right? And here, what we are going to do, we are going to call this read write process for each of the iterations. So some things which we will need it on the other section is right. So we will need this API list part to be called in wrapper process. And we'll also need the loop counter because we don't want to run the setup for headers and we want to skip headers. All right, so we'll just copy this step here. So what we're doing right now is we are breaking existing process and we'll make it into a 2 process setup. Right, then we need to check whether our list is empty or not. For that, we'll come here. Okay, and then also need to check the loop counter. We'll make it integer and initial value will be 2, 0. Sorry. We will check if the loop counter equals to 0. In otherwise section, we will assign the head part in API detail. And then we also need to assign tail to update our list. And we also need to increase our loop counter. Now, in between what we'll do, we will call the sub-process, this read-write sub-process. So now what we first need to do is we need to remove this loop part, right? So So first we'll define API detail field. Entry, which will be any type. On our API detail, which is our temp API detail, which we have used throughout the process, we will assign this, the input field which we have defined into this, the API detail INP, because this is what we will pass from the wrapper process. And this is what this process is going to execute. The last step that is remaining is calling the sub process, read write sub process here. Now, if you see this, now this is the exact same setup what we had before. Only thing is now this part is called as a sub process instead of everything called here. So even if you execute this, this will execute serially and it will execute, it will trigger one sub process for one list entry in the list file. Now what we want is that even if this process is running, we don't want to wait for it and we want to trigger next process. For that, what we'll do, we will send an asynchronous response from this process as soon as we start it. Or if you want to populate some other field or any output field, that's also fine. But for me, I will just start and give a milestone so that the control will be sent back to the wrapper process as soon as the milestone step is executed. So now what will happen as soon as wrapper process is called and it comes to this section, right? It will first create a read write process for first list, and then what it will do, it will basically trigger the next one, because as soon as it calls read write process will send a asynchronous response that yeah, I am triggered, you can carry on to the next process. Now what will happen, it will trigger the next one. So when it triggers it, it will just do this for all the list and then it will come out. And one thing which is missing here is jump step, right? All right. And once everything is completed, this process will just complete. So you, with this kind of configuration, you may notice that even when the read write processes are running, your process wrapper process will just complete because they have a asynchronous milestone step in it. So if we run the wrapper process now, one thing which we missed is we forgot to map the input field of the sub process. So we'll quickly do that. I'll pass the API detail. That's it. Now, if we run the process, we will see that as soon as process starts, it will trigger both of our process. See, and then even though they are running, it is finished, and soon they will be finished as well. So this time, what we did, these two processes ran in parallel. So next, what we have is creating a dispatch queue to control process execution, because right now what we have is um, we have a asynchronous setup where the wrapper process will trigger read write process asynchronously, because as soon as it triggers, it receives the control back, and we saw that two processes were triggered simultaneously. But consider the list is very long, and let's say you have hundreds of processes, so you don't want to load your system by running 100 parallel execution and flood it and make it slow, right? So controlling that, we use dispatch queue. So we'll see how we create dispatch queue. So first of all, it is a agent only service, so your process must be running on agent if you want to use dispatch queue. Other thing is, so for which process you want to create a dispatch queue for. In our case, the process which will be triggered in bulk with the will be this read write process. So we want to create dispatch queue for read write process. So you should go to process properties and copy the name of process. All right, and then if you go to queues, you will see there are already some dispatch queues. So usually they'll be all system dispatch queue, but you can create your own as well. By default, if you don't create any dispatch queue, your request will go to your system default where you have these configurations. Max concurrent, in memory, and queue. So you should make sure that you have enough number in max in memory and max queue, that let's say if you have a list of 1,000, right, then it should be able to contain all these. And then the max concurrent is the one which we will tune in our queue. Let's say we created a new queue, and the queue name should match with the process name. If you want to configure a queue for a process, that's the step. So like we have copied the name, we'll place that name here, and we will set the max concurrent to, let's say, one, in just for demonstration purpose, so that we should see that one process is running, and when it completes, the next one should start. In your case, you can increase it to 5 or 6 or 10, whatever suits your requirement and performance. Okay, so what we did, we just use it one, and let's see how it works. Okay, so now the dispatch queue is created. So if we run our process again, we have a process. If you see, we have one already consumed and one is in executing. So although if we would have triggered more, then you would have seen the rest of the process in queue state, and consumed will show how many you have consumed. So now if you refresh, the one executing would also be consumed. So if you see, the request has started going to this, and we see in our dispatch queue, two processes already came. Yeah, that was all from my side in today's agenda. And so in conclusion, what we saw is how we iterate through a list of APIs based on a file which contains a list of APIs which needs to be called, along with the payload and a file name which contains the list of fields which you need to capture. We also saw how we can break the process into sub-process calls, and how we can use milestone step to make the list call parallel, where we don't wait for the process to complete and we'll trigger the next process. We also saw how we use xquery to extract only the required fields and not all the fields. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone, please post your questions in the Q&A box. We'll try and answer them. The recording for this webinar will be available in the Informatica Support YouTube channel and the Success Portal by tomorrow. You should also be able to download the PDF. Please go ahead, Ishwar.
Yeah, so just a note to everyone that the setup what we saw can be very useful when you have a use case where you have web service where the fields which you want to capture is changing and you don't want to create swagger every time when there is a change. And in these kind of dynamic setup, you can think of a setup like this for making the use case easy. Thanks. Yeah, that was it. Yeah, so the queue setup is a part of product, and you can create this for each of the process what you have. So the question was the dispatch queue functionality which we use. Is it a CEI feature or is it additional product or license? So yes, it is a part of product which we can use.
Hi, Romando. We'll be uploading the recording in the Informatica Support YouTube channel and the Success Portal. In the Success Portal, you should be able to view the recording in the Tech Tuesdays page. Also, the recording will be sent to you after this, right after this webinar. Hope I answered your question. Also, please put in your feedbacks and suggestions in the upcoming survey that follows this webinar. We would like to know your feedbacks and your suggestions for the future Tech Tuesdays webinars. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. We'll wait for some more time. Looks like we have answered most of the questions that came in. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Ishwar, and all the panelists who have joined and kept aside some time for this webinar. Thanks a lot. See you on our next Tech Tuesdays. Bye.
Thank you.